Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. We will be spending a minute or so letting everyone into the event, and then we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. Just spending a minute or so letting everyone in, and then we will get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're just going to get started here in about 1 minute. Great. All right. Well, good evening and welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. My name is Tara Johnson Nome. I am a member of Behringer-Crawford Museum's Board of Trustees. It is so nice to see you all here this evening. I am so happy to see you here on this 22nd episode of the Northern Kentucky History Hour. We've had a very fun few months together as we're walking through Northern Kentucky's very interesting and rich history. Very happy to see a number of my fellow trustees here on tonight's meeting. So thank you so much to all of the trustees, the museum staff, and all of our supporters for everything that you do to make this program possible. I also want to thank a few of our financial contributors, the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, the Kentucky Arts Council, the Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, and the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. U.S. Bank Foundation. Thank you all so much. And thank you to our members. If you're not already a member of Behringer-Crawford Museum, we would love for you to check out our website, bcmuseum.org, where you can find access to a lot of the programming that goes on at the museum inside as well as virtually, and really find out how it's such a treasure for our Northern Kentucky community. Tonight, before we get started, I think many of you have been with us before and sort of know these parameters, but for those of you, I see a few new names with us this evening. Want to just say, even though the mics are muted, we are very interested in having you contribute to the conversation tonight. So if you have a question or a comment that you would like to share, please include it in the chat box. And I will make sure to gather up all of those comments and make sure to ask our guests at the end. Also, we will be having our quiz tonight. I will confess that I'm a little bit behind in sending out our prizes, so I hope to get to that this weekend. But those of you who have won in the past, you will know that you win a Northern Kentucky History Hour button, as well, of course, as bragging rights. So when we get to our quiz, if you want to you got to be the first person to put the correct answer in the chat. So definitely appreciate everyone for taking part. It kind of makes it a little fun. You got to pay attention to when the quiz comes up. So thanks in advance for that. We also are streaming live on Facebook. So if you talk to a friend and tell them, please, that you enjoyed tonight's presentation, or if you want to see one of our past presentations, they are all available on Behringer-Crawford's Facebook page and on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. Also on YouTube are the curator chats that are hosted by Curator of Collections, Jason French. Jason is an amazing resource at the museum, and he hosts shorter instructional and informational videos about items from Behringer-Crawford's collection, as well as places in the community, and they're really entertaining. He does such a nice job, so I'd really encourage you all to check those out as well. They're all on YouTube, and some of them might be 10 minutes, others might be only 4. And so it's just a fun way to get to know some of the details that he's able to provide. So definitely check that out. So without, let's see if there's nothing else. So I am very pleased to introduce you to tonight's speaker. Hillary Delaney is lead researcher of Underground Railroad and African American history with the Boone County Public Library's Local History and Genealogy team. In her role in the local history and genealogy department, Hillary began to research the history of the Underground Railroad in Boone County, which, with the exception of a few examples, has largely been lost to time. Drawing on her background in journalism, she discovered many stories of freedom seekers and Underground Railroad activity in our local area. This project led to a larger initiative to fully document the African American individuals and families and their importance in Boone County's history. Programs and projects that grew from these research efforts have resulted in national recognition and inclusion in Boone County Public Library's local history and genealogy department in the National Park Service's Network to Freedom. I'm so pleased to have her with us tonight. Hillary, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tara. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. It's so nice to be among those who love history as much as I do. And I'd like to thank Behringer-Crawford as well. What a wonderful place you all have there. As Tara said, I've been researching this for a number of years, and the story that I want to share with you all tonight is one of my favorites. It's one that I worked on very early in my research, and it involves an African-American conductor on the Underground Railroad, which is very rare to know this person's identity. So it's kind of a smoking gun for researchers, which is really fun to find. And it's nice to have all the information that we have found subsequent to that. So I'll go ahead and start my presentation so you all don't have to look at me. I mean, you can look at some really interesting things about the Underground Railroad here in Northern Kentucky. All righty. And so I guess you've all gathered that such a long title, I had to fit a lot in there, but in case you've never heard this area referred to as a borderlands, the reason we call it that is because the Ohio River formed the border between enslavement and freedom when slavery was still legal. So that's sort of why we use that language. But it's also sort of interesting that these communities that lie on both sides of the river were sort of intermeshed, and the people there all had relationships that sort of crossed the river as well, which made it kind of a tricky place to be, honestly, when slavery was legal on one side and not on the other. And I'm sure you're all aware that we have the Freedom Center in Cincinnati, and that's not a mistake that it's there. There was a lot of Underground Railroad activity through this area, which is why they chose that location. And we're so close. Tonight, I'm focusing on Boone County, which is where I focus a lot of my research, although it does tend to sort of spread out throughout Northern Kentucky and points north, just naturally. But the main focus really tonight is on this family, the Barkshires. The Barkshires lived originally in Boone County as enslaved people before they were free and living in Rising Sun. If you're familiar with Rabbit Hash, which some of you may be, Rabbit Hash and Rising Sun are directly across the river from one another. I gave you these views here so that you could see it's sort of almost like looking across a broad street. They're that close together. And the river itself was actually much narrower and more shallow during the time that I'm discussing. They actually dredged it out and made it a little deeper and widened it for all the riverboat traffic that began to come and go. So it really probably even seemed closer. And these communities had relationships. I mean, it was like a town that was cut in half in some ways. The communities themselves, some people had family on both sides of the river. They certainly had friends. They did their shopping maybe across the river or went to church across the river. So as far as the enslavement side of that went, if you can imagine, people had strong feelings about this. And although it was legal in Kentucky and not legal in Indiana, that didn't mean that everybody felt the same as their neighbors on each side. So there was a lot of discourse about it. There were people who cooperated in helping people to freedom or cooperated in catching people who were trying to gain their freedom, likewise with opposition. So, you know, the spy games were there, and the more research I do, the more I'm convinced that they were a lot more organized than any of us know or suspected. When an escape would occur from enslaved Boone County, right? Typically, the people who were looking for the missing person would go directly to someone that they suspected. Could be on the Boone County side of the river, could be on the Indiana or Ohio side of the river, but you look first where you think this person might go for help. Samuel Barkshire is the sort of the lead person in this whole story, and he was the first one freed from enslavement. As Samuel moved across the river, his family was still enslaved. When people started to disappear, who do you think they'd look to first? The free man of color, right? So that's one area that there was a lot of suspicion, but there was also suspicion amongst enslaved people when they tried to escape. Who should they trust, right? They were often told by slaveholders that abolitionists were actually trying to trick them and sell them south. And so that being said, it was really hard for people to know where to go unless they were given this sort of secret network that worked its way into our area. It really picked up steam in the 1840s and 50s, although the Barkshires were there earlier. There was a great deal of intimidation that went on when the slavery discussion heated up. And fear, of course, was always there because slavery was legal. And if you helped people escape, then you could be arrested or worse. As far as interpersonal relationships in this Borderlands area, we did see a lot of kind of complex interwoven things happening. So there would be abolitionists that came to the area specifically to try to help slaves to freedom, and Underground Railroad workers who were outsiders and no one knew who they were. So that was interesting to see that these people from outside are coming in. Meanwhile, the enslaver is across the river from Rising Sun, and he's the person that they know. So, you know, that's kind of a weird way to put it, but even if you disagreed with slavery, if the stranger is coming to town and stirring up trouble, it can be very complicated. Enslaved people and their slaveholders also had complex relationships with this border. Sometimes if a person was enslaved, they would be trusted to do business for the slaveholder across the river. They'd be given a pass. A lot of times when I present this, I get questions from people about why didn't that person just run away when they were on free soil? It's a complicated question to answer because I would feel that way, and I'm sure that a lot of people would want to do that, and some did. But typically there was some sort of leverage to keep that person from making that choice. So if you send someone to do your marketing for you across the river on free soil and give them a pass, you may remind them that they have a wife and child that are still in Kentucky. And so that was often a way that would complicate that trip for them. Sometimes parents and children were separated by that river as well. And this could be enslaved parents and children, but also free people. So it's a really complicated arrangement that we had going on there. There were those freedom seekers, there were those agents. We had patrollers on the Boone County side who were landowners that were tasked with this patrolling of the river often. They would be looking for runaways, looking for agents. And then we had people who, like Samuel Barkshire that I'm going to tell you about, was formerly enslaved, which meant he had a former slave holder. Typically, you wouldn't think that this would be a relationship that you would maintain too closely, but in his case, this is why it makes it unusual. He did maintain that relationship, and I'll tell you more about that here. So there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of people in this story. And I told Tara I have a handout that I can send you later, and I'll put my email address into the chat so that you all can have that if you have any questions that are lingering and I don't get to them, or if you would like more information. But I want to tell you about these folks because I think they're fascinating. The Barkshire family, like I said, Samuel Barkshire is the head of the family, and he was born into an enslaved state. So he was a slave at birth in 1798. He was born actually in Harrison County. He was enslaved by a man named Dickie Barkshire, which is where the name comes from. And Dickie Barkshire died about 1829. When he died, Samuel was transferred through his son Felix Barkshire to a man named Joseph Hawkins. And we'll talk about him in a minute, but he was also in Boone County. Dickie Barkshire had owned property both in Boone County, Grant County, and Harrison County. So he was kind of around Northern Kentucky for a while. So Samuel was an enslaved man. He was married to a woman named Frances Newman, and she was born in Georgia. We know this from records later after she was free. We don't know how she came here, but I can tell you that Dickie Barkshire was in the Revolutionary War. Although he was born in England, he fought against the British and was given some land, some of which was in Georgia. So it's possible she came back from Georgia when he went to inspect this bounty land he received. Samuel and Frances, they had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, like the Brady Bunch. They had, their eldest was Arthur Barkshire. I labeled these folks sort of by what I know about them. So Arthur, I called him formerly enslaved, which like is a hint that he will then be freed. He became an Underground Railroad conductor, and he was a civil rights activist. And I know the civil rights movement, most people associate that with the 60s. In this case, he made some moves that were defying the rules on behalf of his own rights. And we'll talk about that aside from the Underground Railroad work that he did. So he was the oldest. He and his dad were both coopers by trade, meaning he was making barrels for all the distilleries up and down the river. His brother Garrett was quite interesting. Garrett was an Underground Railroad conductor, but he also worked on riverboats. And Garrett's the romantic part of the story. Garrett would actually work on the riverboats, and then the riverboats would take him south all the way to New Orleans. Along the way back, he would help hide people in the boats to get them to freedom. During one of these trips, he hid this woman. She was discovered at some point and taken to Louisville. She was recaptured. She was going to be sent back to Louisiana. And Garrett's family was so well connected to the Anti-Slavery Society in Cincinnati, of whom there were some wealthy people, that he immediately went for help, got the money to buy her, bought her, married her, and had a child with her. So I think at some point they fell in love during this escape attempt. But he was doing that very dangerous work. So he was going to the South to help people to freedom in the North. So they didn't just stay in Rising Sun and in the borderlands. They were really reaching out quite a bit. Woodford is the youngest boy, and he was a teenager when he began leading people to freedom. And there's some indication that he would lead them all the way to Canada in some cases. If any of you are parents of teenage boys, I can't imagine. I have one, obviously, but this family is full of brave folks. The women are harder. So we know Frances, and we know Emily, Matilda, and Minerva were all family members, the last 3 being the girls, the daughters. We don't have a lot of information about what they did. They may have just been on the home front, but I can guarantee that if people were being hidden in their home and all of this conducting was going on like crazy around them, that they knew exactly what was going on and were probably assisting in some way or another. It's just harder to document with the women. So once Samuel was transferred, his ownership of him was transferred from Dickie Barkshire to Joseph Hawkins in Boone County. He also became the property of Nancy Hawkins, who was Joseph's wife. Some language in her will later leads us to believe that she, along with some other things, that she may have been the consort of Dickie Barkshire himself between his 2 wives that we know about. It's a little complicated, and I'm not positive yet, but I have a little bit of an inkling that she may have been involved with Dickie. She knew the family much better than her husband did. She knew all of the Barkshire children's birth dates, which is very unusual for a slaveholder to know the actual day that they were born, because that wouldn't have been something she would have been necessarily involved in. And there were other enslaved people too. So this is a pretty, by Boone County standards, they owned a good amount of slaves. Her husband, Joseph, that we know for sure she was married to, when he died, he left her everything. His entire estate. He was wealthy. He did have family around, but they got nothing. Nancy got it all. He died in 1836, only 3 years after he had freed Samuel. And Samuel was freed for $1, meaning it was a symbolic gesture. I think he was purchased from the Barkshire family by Joseph for that purpose. Joseph was a devout Baptist. He went to Middle Creek Baptist Church. In some family lore, he's known as a very pious man. There were a lot of things going on in the first and second quarters of the 19th century within the churches, and there were rifts everywhere where people were struggling with the morality of slavery. And Joseph may have been having a moment where he was leaning more towards emancipation. He had freed a woman named Violet, who is also on this page. She was formerly enslaved as well by the Hawkins family and appeared to be a very close friend to Nancy throughout her life. They were baptized into Middle Creek Church together, and then they both became Campbellites. And if you're not familiar with the Campbellites, that was a sect that was also vehemently anti-slavery. And so she was close to them. As soon as Joseph did die in 1836, Nancy began to put the wheels in motion to move across the river to Rising Sun, where Samuel Barkshire had already just settled, and he was setting up his business. And so she sold the land that she had in Boone County, bought property in what would become Ohio County, Indiana. It was still Dearborn at this point. We don't know for sure if her house was standing when she purchased the property, but there was a house there very soon after if it wasn't standing. And the house is still there. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, but this house is very important to the Underground Railroad activity in this area. So Samuel Barkshire was already getting settled. Nancy joined him with his entire family in tow, who lived with her initially, as well as all these people that you see in green, dark green on the presentation screen there. So Violet, who was already free, a woman named Mariah, a man named Sandy, and a woman named Catherine. So the people on this page are all adults. Samuel Barkshire's children were not at this point. I think that Nancy Hawkins very consciously started emancipating or manumitting these enslaved people in a way that would protect them. And when I say that, what I mean is it was very easy for people, especially women and children who were free people of color, to be re-enslaved through apprenticeships or indentures. So she was very conscious in the way she did this. So she waited until she got all of her accounts settled, and they moved, and she actually had Catherine and her husband Joseph Eddington got married, and he's kind of important in the Underground Railroad traffic as well, which is interesting to me that would be the person that this woman who was newly freed would marry. Mariah and Sandy were a couple, Sandy being the husband in that couple. So those three were all freed, along with Frances, who was Samuel Barkshire's wife. Sandy Hawkins took off and went south, which is the opposite of what some people would think would happen when you're freed from enslavement. You would go north or go to Canada for sure. But Sandy was also working on the Underground Railroad. This was like an entire network of people all connected to the Hawkins family and to the Barkshires. Sandy went south. He was in New Orleans, and he was accused of hiding enslaved people in his home, which is how we know this information. And so that's interesting. Mariah kind of dropped off the map, but Catherine, as I said, got married to a man named Joseph Eddington, sometimes Edrington. It changes frequently. So they're all free at that point, and that was in 1838 that they were all manumitted by Nancy. Nancy's moved into her home, which is in Rising Sun. She has the children living with her some of the time. As you may know, in 1850 is when we started seeing all the household members listed. So we only can go by the tick marks that we see in 1840 to know who was where. I think that Samuel was setting up his shop. He may have lived near his shop, we think, but he didn't own the property, so there's no deed. So they were very near each other, Nancy Hawkins's house and Samuel Barkshire's shop. And so we think that they were at least neighbors, if not living in the same home for a while. By 1850, they're listed separately on the census record. So we do know by then what's happening. Violet remained with Nancy. At some point, Joseph Edrington's children, Joseph was Catherine's husband. Catherine must have either died or disappeared at some point because he got remarried, but he had 3 children. And he and his wife, second wife, Mary, disappeared off all records as far as I can tell by 1850, and the children kind of scattered, one of whom lived with the Barkshires. And you'll see that in the records. They were taking in people on pretty much a regular basis, either freedom seekers or people who just needed a place to live. So this house, I know it doesn't look like a whole lot, but this home was originally Nancy Hawkins's home. It functioned as an Underground Railroad station. And that's unusual because she was a former slaveholder. She was actually helping Samuel Barkshire and his family hide runaways. As I said before, Samuel would have been suspect to the slaveholders. Anytime somebody went missing, they would probably come knocking on his door. And there are accounts that he had been threatened with being kidnapped and re-enslaved because of this activity, but they were never really able to catch him. Part of the reason was because Nancy, who was a fairly wealthy and well-respected elderly white woman, was hiding these people in her home to protect Samuel and Frances and the kids. The Barkshires are so interesting, partially because they have a footprint. Samuel in particular has a paper trail. That makes him really unusual when it comes to research of even free people of color. Sometimes they get missed when the person who's gathering the information is taking census records or tax records. Sometimes they just don't show up. Samuel Barkshire shows up a lot. As I said before, he was a cooper. This is the 1850 census, so that you can see sort of what was happening with him. If you look at where I have circled race, the reason that I call that out is because Samuel Barkshire is listed with an M for race, which is mulatto. We don't use that anymore, that terminology, but that's an indication that he was a mixed racial heritage, as was Frances. Now, the children, it looks a little different and a little confusing. It's in the eye of the beholder. But the reason that I showed you that is because we think the relationship between Samuel, Nancy, and Dickie Barkshire is interesting. And there may be some blood ties between those 3. So we'll see. If that ever surfaces, I would love to know the answer. But you can see that there are a couple extra people here. So you have Samuel and Frances and the children, the 6 children, but there's another child, Harriet. She's actually the daughter of Joseph Edrington after he somehow disappeared. So I think that she was orphaned. And a man named Thomas James, who's 93, from Maryland, probably a former slave. And at 93 years, he may have not had anywhere to go. Just another sort of indication that that the Barkshires were helpers. They were just helpers, taking people in. As I said, Samuel's great because he has such a paper trail. He and his son both appeared in the 1859-1860 Rising Sun Directory. They probably were in lots of directories before then, but we don't have those. It struck me that that he's listed, and he and his son are both coopers, but they have 2 separate shops, so they were obviously not in business together, but doing the same thing. That could be because they were operating 2 different locations, and this was a good front for them as well. They also aren't listed as African American. Typically in these directories, sometimes there's a C for colored. I don't know why they did that, but they did it, and I don't see that here, which is unusual. He advertised in the paper, the clipping that you see there was one of the first ads he placed as he was setting up his shop in the 1830s. And I wonder, I'm not positive about this, but I wonder if he wasn't a little more educated than one would expect someone who had grown up as a slave. because he's doing the financial work that he needs to set up his business. He may have been literate, we don't know. But he's advertising. He's putting ads in the paper and he's setting up this business. And that gives us yet another piece of paper to sort of follow him through history. So as I began to research him, I reached beyond the end of slavery and found that Samuel was also mentioned in one of those place histories that some of you all who are aficionados of history might be familiar with. There were a lot of histories done of counties throughout the country, beginning, I guess, at the centennial, about 1876. But they went on for years, and people would write about the founders of the town and what the town was like at its founding. Samuel is mentioned with a great deal of affection in Ohio County's history, and where he went to church, where his home was, where his business was. And so he was clearly a feature in this town, which is also unusual, considering the fact that he was doing work that was illegal and could actually bring trouble to the town. And so I find that fascinating about him, that he was well liked there by all. He was well known to Levi Coffin, and if you're not familiar with Levi Coffin, he's considered the nickname is the superintendent of the Underground Railroad. He did settle in Cincinnati after having been in Indiana for years doing Underground Railroad work. He was a Quaker. He was quite wealthy. He ran things in Cincinnati as far as the Underground Railroad was concerned. And so we know a little bit more about Samuel because Laura Smith Haviland, another abolitionist who was she lived in Michigan. She was helping people to freedom a lot. And she wrote her memoirs in 1882. She mentions Samuel Barkshire and Joseph Edrington. She spells it differently, but it's him. And that she was introduced to them as the people to go talk to in Rising Sun about Underground Railroad work by Levi Coffin and the Anti-Slavery Society. So that's really great that we have all this information about him. So Arthur, the eldest son, as he was doing Underground Railroad work, which was illegal, of course, he was also breaking other rules. Indiana had black laws that these laws were established to prevent people who were African American from settling in Indiana. And Arthur didn't take that line down. He married a woman who was a free woman of color in Cincinnati named Elizabeth Keith. She had been married previously and had children. He brought her to Ohio County, married her in 1854. And then in 1850, right after he married her and brought her to town, he was fined for bringing this woman into the state. And the fine was for encouraging Negro immigration. And so it was illegal for him to bring his own wife into the state. He appealed the decision, probably more because he just disagreed with that than for the $10. They really told him he had to get out of the state, but at that point, no one was forcing him to leave. They just kind of left him alone. But he appealed it and he took it all the way to the Indiana Supreme Court. Sadly, the court upheld the lower court's decision, and yet he still stayed in town with his wife and her children until 1859. So another full 5 years he lived there after he was told to go. And then all of a sudden there was this mysterious article about a dead infant that was found in the river. And there was a charge that the infant was the product of a relationship between Arthur and his stepdaughter, who is 16. After looking at this a million different ways, we think that they may have been trying to get him out, partially because he was defying the rules, but also because he was helping people escape, which often brought slave hunters and slave owners to town and made things uncomfortable. When this accusation came to pass, the young girl and her mother denied everything, refused to testify. There really wasn't a trial. An angry mob came, with pitchforks and torches or whatever they had at the time, and chased the family out. And then an article stated that had they been behaving themselves properly, they could have stayed. And so it's interesting that the baby kind of isn't even mentioned anymore. So we suspect from this article and another that they were actually looking for a reason to just get them out of town. Back to Nancy Hawkins, who owned the house, who was a previous slaveholder of this family. She is mysterious. There's very little known about her. I can't find marriages for her anywhere, but I can find other marriages and other documents related to the people that she was connected to. She seems to have appeared out of nowhere. The heirs to her entire estate, I know the house doesn't look like much, but she had money. The only heirs that she named were the Barkshires, the Barkshire children rather, and her friend Violet. So all of her heirs were formerly enslaved African Americans, which is very unusual because there were Hawkins family members nearby, and she had other friends that lived nearby. She took a lot of personal risk for this family, so we find that kind of fascinating as well, that she was doing this Underground Railroad work. The clear relationships with the Hawkins family that lived nearby and the Barkshire children that lived nearby, we don't find ties there at all, even though they're all in the same area. So she left all of her stuff to these folks. Violet got all of her personal items like clothing, jewelry. The three girls got furniture and silver. And the boys were given what, as she stated it, the proceeds of the sale of her home. But they decided, it was 1854 when she died, they decided that they would rather keep the home. So they were given the right to bid on the home on their own behalf and buy it for the same price that it would have taken. And so basically the deed was turned over to them and then continued to hide people there. So they carried on their work in this home. So this timeline is just sort of a visual representation of what was happening with Samuel and all the people around him. And what I like to look at is the fact that his manumission in 1833 is just the beginning of what he was doing. Although we know when he was in Boone County, he bought 100 acres right after he was manumitted. I think that was a money-making thing. I think he had saved money, but boy, that was a lot of acreage for somebody to buy when they had just been enslaved. We think that he was possibly helping people to freedom even within Boone County. He kind of falls on the routes that we're aware of. So we think his activity started quite early. And then you can see how the family progressed as they moved across the river, and how Arthur's troubles kind of came into things, although he was defiant. He did end up going to moving into Ohio. He joined the United States Colored Troops for the Union, and he died in Virginia during the war. The other children in the family kind of scattered. Woodford died in Rising Sun and is buried there. Nancy obviously is buried there. Samuel and his wife are buried in Rising Sun. So a good deal of the family did stay in place. And part of the reason that we learned a lot of this information about who was escaping and who was helping them is because there was a mysterious newspaper clipping that really checked out. And it told the story of several different escapes from Boone County that Samuel Barkshire helped in. And I was able to sort of back trace that and find out that really was the truth. So this really secretive network right there in the Borderlands in Rising Sun, it wasn't just Samuel and Nancy and their connections. There were a few other people that we think may have been helping. Shadrach Hathaway, who was a town founder in Rising Sun, he had, this building is still standing there if you ever go to Rising Sun. It's a charming little historic area. And I think the building has been a number of things, bed and breakfast, there have been restaurants there. I don't know what's there now, but I've always heard rumors that there was Underground Railroad activity there. It's right on the river, so yes, that's possible. But it was part of Shadrach Hathaway's store and grocery. It's right on Front Street and 4th, right down the street from the Hawkins house and Samuel's shop. He was a Universalist, Shadrach was, and they were anti-slavery. He also opened a store right at a crossing point that we know about in Vevey. So if he wasn't involved, he certainly looked the other way. This man, Dr. Israel Evans, he came from a family that's well documented in Underground Railroad history in Ohio. And he ended up practicing medicine in Rising Sun. His nephew came to study with him, meanwhile working as a teacher across the river in Boone County. So he may have been doing a little bit of recon work, possibly. And then in 1848, Evans moved to Bromley, and the house that you see on the right there was his home. It's called Landmark. It's a historic home. It was there long before Evans was, but that's another location that we have lots of family, lots of descendants of people who lived there who say that this was an Underground Railroad stop. So it's possible that that was the case during the time that Dr. Evans was there. Laura Smith Haviland, this is the woman that I mentioned to you, just so you can get a look at her. She's a tough little bird. She was very small, but she took on slave hunters and all kinds of folks. She followed the path that a lot of the activists of her day did. She was an abolitionist who became an advocate for the soldiers and their care during the war, and then women's rights, suffrage. So she spent her life kind of fighting the power. And she also came here frequently to help people to freedom. Her memoir is quite interesting. I encourage you, if you like that kind of thing, to read it. It's available in Google Books and archive.org, as well as in print. But she's a pretty neat lady. So all those folks and then some that I mentioned were all sort of, if you see where the first ward and the second ward are, those pink areas, those 8 blocks, and then the little sections closer to the river are where most of these folks were. There's a couple little scattered locations here and there, but if you can see where 4th Street goes straight to the river, Samuel Barkshire's shop was on the left-hand side, about 3 blocks up, and the home that Nancy Hawkins had was on the right side at the corner of Poplar and 4th. If you walked out the front door of that home and looked to your left, you could see rising sun. It was a perfect view, both for defensive reasons and for helping people. They were also very close to the Universalist Church. Metellus Calvert, he worked for Shadrach Hathaway. He was actually an administrator of Nancy's estate that she left to all the African Americans, but he was the son-in-law of one of the men whose slaves Nancy helped to hide, which is quite interesting. That's one of those weird relationships I was talking about. So maybe the son was a rebel, or the son-in-law was a rebel, and he didn't believe the same way his father-in-law did. And so he was more anti-slavery. Joseph Edrington had a business right downtown. And Theophilus Jones is a name that I haven't told you yet, but he's the one that we think his son wrote the letter that I found in a newspaper that gave a lot of details about some of these escapes and who was involved after the fact. And he was also a cooper, which makes that connection even stronger to the Barkshires. And then, of course, Dr. Israel Evans, he had an office right on the river, but his home was just a couple blocks back. And we know about his views on slavery. So all of this, there are very few smoking guns in this type of research that haven't already been known. And with an African-American Underground Railroad person, it was much more dangerous to talk about this stuff. So we're really lucky that we have found all of this information kind of late in the game. And I guess it just kind of got lost in history, but now we have it. And I think there's probably more to find, but I guess that will come as it comes.
People can write in questions. Look at this.
So thank you all so much for taking all of that in. I want to give you some time if you need to ask questions, because it's a lot of information at once. But I'd love to answer any questions that you have.
Great. Oh my goodness, that was so fascinating. Thank you so much. We do have a number of questions. And so I'm going to start with the chat. I'm going to kind of go in chronological order to try to sort of track along with the story. So we actually have a question from Facebook about and just to make sure that everybody kind of remembers. One of the questions was, can you cover again when the Barkshire family was in Boone County? Can you just talk a little bit about where was it again that they lived?
So they were near Middle Creek. Their property, the property where they lived when they were enslaved was, if you know where Bellevue is, I know a lot of people may not. Bellevue is right on the river. It's just downriver from Petersburg, another tiny, tiny river town, which was a lot more lively in those days, I think. But Bellevue, now the Bellevue Baptist Church is the kind of what replaced Middle Creek Baptist. Middle Creek Baptist was just up the hill. Bellevue is a little flatter and it's right on the river. And the land of both Dickie Barkshire, when he had land in Boone County, his land bordered Joseph Hawkins. And Samuel bought some land a little further inland, and that was the 100 acres that I referred to. That's sort of on a path, if you're familiar with the ridge line that runs along the river. If you're looking at it from Indiana, there were a lot of sort of safer spots for enslaved people to escape along that ridge line, including our Universalist church. And so we think that Samuel's land was right along there and part of that path.
Gotcha. Really so fascinating. I'm gonna have to drive down there again soon. So
We do tours. When we get back in person, you can come on one of our tours.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let me get back to our, so you spoke about when they were enslaved and then they were manumitted. Can you talk about that term a little bit? I'm not sure I'm using it in context properly. But...
Right, and that is confusing. So manumission is it's terminology only. The result is the same. So we all know emancipation because we hear that a lot. Emancipation is more of an act of decree than it is a personal transference. Because enslaved people were property, typically when you see someone manumitted, the way that they did it here in Boone County, in the case of Samuel Barkshire, it was a deed. So it's in the deed books. Joseph Hawkins basically sold Samuel to himself. It's unusual, but it was early in the game when that happened. So later, there were manumissions that were being done in the Court of Common Pleas in Cincinnati, but because Cincinnati has had so many courthouse disasters, that book is not anywhere to be found as far as I know, at least most of it. But there were people that were freed either through a will or through a deed. And sometimes you'll hear emancipation being used and sometimes manumission. So it's essentially the same thing.
Gotcha. And that was one of the questions. Let's see. So, okay. So going forward toward, we need to do our trivia question.
I gave a lot of hints.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's do one more question and then we'll do here, let's do the trivia question first. And so that way people have a chance to answer. And then we'll go to this other question about some of the evidence around
Sure.
everything. So do you want to ask that, Hillary?
Oh, the question of yeah. So the question that I came up with, which I think most of you will probably answer it pretty quickly, but what made, from a research standpoint, what made Samuel Barkshire and the Barkshire family unique and unusual?
So this, for our audience, those that have been sticking with us for a while, is you had to have been paying attention, right? It's like the true, like there'll be a quiz at the end,
right?
Which is fun. Sometimes we have sort of related trivia questions, but this one actually was mentioned in the presentation. So if you have an answer, go ahead and list that in the chat. And then, okay, we're going to go actually back to manumissions for a second.
Okay. So
Janine Kreinbrink, who is actually a fairly regular presenter on our program, was wondering, are most manumissions listed in deed books or in probate?
I know Janine. Hi, Janine. So the answer is yes. so it varies so much by locality, but also depending on who the clerk was at the time, who the people involved were. And I know that sounds like a non-answer, but I have seen manumissions that were a handshake deal and mentioned later in a different transaction that had to do with an estate. Say if an enslaved person was freed at some point and it doesn't appear in any of those places where you would look, there might be a mention in the estate settlement with the heirs saying, except for this person who was freed on this date. That's not a paper that person could carry with them. So there probably was something handwritten somewhere. In the case of some of these, they're filed officially with the courts. We see them in court orders sometimes, probate sometimes, and sometimes there is a visit to the court after this person's already been freed by the will of someone who died maybe. And they show up at the court. They give the court basically records a physical description of them, their age, their name, so that if they were to be stopped, they could prove who they were.
Wow. That seems like that would have made it so difficult, even for someone who had been free, or even just was even born free, to be able to truly prove that.
Yeah, and sometimes people did, I mean, I didn't really go into this too deeply, but sometimes people who were free were kidnapped and re-enslaved. And because they didn't have much power, if you didn't have somebody in your corner, it could be very difficult to get free after that happened.
So awful. Okay, so we have a number of correct answers. So great job to Gretchen, Paul, and Keith. Thank you guys for answering. We're going to give this one to Marianne Mulcahy because she was the first correct answer. So Marianne, we probably have your address in when you registered. But if by any chance, Marianne, that you did not include your address, there's ways to get around that. Go ahead and private message me here in the chat, and we will make sure that you receive your button. So thank you so much for playing the quiz, and how fun. Okay, so we had another question about the, hold on, I'm trying to find it. Oh, yes. So back when in the presentation, when you were showing the map and all the different individuals in, I believe it was in Rising Sun, so over in Indiana, where they all were so close together.
Yeah.
The question is, do we, there's certainly, it's easy to infer, right, that there was all this activity happening and evidence that each one of them were participating. But is there any direct evidence that Chandler or Barkshire knew and actually worked with Evans or Hathaway? Is the question.
I would say no. I don't have direct mention anywhere that's documented that says, hey, this happened. But I'll tell you what, even with the documentation that we do have on Samuel, until I found the newspaper article that led me to dig into some of what it indicated, I didn't have much of a smoking gun. I worked on there's a historic marker in front of the home that Nancy Hawkins owned and later gave to the Barkshire Sons. And I worked on that marker submission, and getting Indiana Historical Bureau to document an Underground Railroad station is very, very difficult. And so I had to drown them in supporting evidence based almost solely on this letter that was sort of indicating that property. And so, no, I think probably what we look for most, and it sometimes plays out and we sometimes do find that smoking gun, but you have to look at connections. You have to look at church membership. You have to look at proximity like we did. Now with Israel Evans, we know that his family was very well documented in Hillsborough as being Underground Railroad station masters. And so it would make a little sense that he might be inclined to help, especially living in this little river town. Some folks who were involved in this kind of work were strategically placed for a reason. We did have an uptick in escape activity that happened in the 1840s that went all the way through the 1850s, and big numbers at once. So there was some coordination happening, although we can't, unless someone wrote a letter or a memoir that's turned up, it's very hard to find those things. Hathaway, I'm on the fence a little with him. I think that he was probably anti-slavery. Whether or not he was willing to put his livelihood at risk, we don't know. But it's sort of the question I like to ask people is, sort of a what would you do moment, because sometimes people would just show up at your door needing help. Some of the help that we see being offered in history has a passive element to it, like people would leave food out or shoes or something helpful, while others were very actively involved. So it's much harder to pin that down when there's no smoking gun. I think I include him because I'm inclined to think that, as I said in the presentation, he knew what was going on. So if anything, he was looking the other way. And he could have been a funder. There were lots of wealthy businessmen who just lent their money to the Anti-Slavery Society to use to help with that activity.
Gotcha. That's
Yeah.
so my question for you is, in your research, what's next, or what are you sort of hoping
There's so
to
much.
find next?
Well, so when I began to do this, I realized, as I'm sort of midstream in gathering Underground Railroad information, that I should be documenting these people specifically for the purposes of genealogy. Because if you're African American and descended from enslaved people, the paper trail stops at 1870 and you can't get further back in a lot of cases. So I began to gather that. I'm now up to, 3,500 individuals documented-ish, somewhere in there. That will continue. There's many more to find, but we've been working hard at putting this information into a new platform that we're using that can make connections that are hard to make otherwise. Like if this person was enslaved by this person and then they were sold to this person, it kind of makes a big web and connects all those pieces. So if someone is coming here to do research or even doing it digitally, they know where to go next. And it's a huge help for me, even as a researcher, to see those connections, because it's a shortcut, So we've been working on that, and that is the Borderlands. It's actually named the Borderlands website. So you can get to that through our homepage. I can put a link up in a minute too. But it's still in development, but you can still look at it. We also have been doing some programming with the National Park Service. We're working on a video project that is going to be it's a series of 5 short videos based on some stories that have connections to both Boone County and Northern Kentucky. And it is, the title is The Legacy of Enslaved Mothers. And I'm sure most of you have heard of Margaret Garner. Of course, we include her because she's the best known. Although we include some other folks that might be real interesting because they're new to people. And we always get asked about Margaret Garner, and that's a heartbreaking story. And I almost want to leave her alone and let her rest for a minute sometimes. Yeah. But her story also is so well known. I mean, there are operas and paintings and songs and, Toni Morrison and all that just for Margaret Garner. So that's going to be part of it, but that will be coming up in September of 2021, I believe.
Wonderful.
So we've got some projects.
It sounds like it. It sounds like you have quite a few projects. I know
Yeah.
On the genealogy piece, I'm a big fan of PBS's show about genealogy, and they talk about a lot how challenging that it can be. Yeah. And I know recently I believe it was on Fresh Air on NPR, they were also talking about the real national effort to try to help make those connections, and how often you do have to trace it back to unfortunately the slaveholder in order to be able to help people kind of piece this.
I'm thrilled to see that other people are doing it, and I just came across a newly developed database that's growing in Pendleton County, and the local history librarian there, Fran Carr, is the one I think responsible for putting that together. She and I kind of put our heads together a couple of years ago, and she had already begun doing that. And she asked me how I found some of these other things through my research. And she put up this great thing on their library website in their genealogy page. So I just like seeing that's growing, because that makes it that much easier for people to make connections.
For sure. Well, we really appreciate your work, and we definitely appreciate you being with us tonight. As you get closer, when it's time to to unveil, I guess, or preview your National Park Service videos. We would, love to figure out a way to maybe even show them at the museum. That would
Oh, that'd be great.
awesome.
What we designed them so that they could be consumed in small bites or all at once. And so, yeah, I keep an eye on the website. I will put up the Borderlands website as well, so that
Wonderful.
you guys can take a look at that. Although I warn you, they were having some sort of technology related problem, our platform was. So hopefully they have solved that. I hate to point you to something that doesn't look the way it should.
Well, we will try to add that in to the event page for this too, so that if anybody wants to check back, later,
Great.
that they're able to do that.
Great.
So everybody, all of our participants, we've kept everybody for our hour, and we thank you for joining us, everyone. Please join me in thanking Ms. Delaney for this incredible work and a really special presentation. And I hope that you all join us next week, where we will be hearing about Kentucky's Astronomer General, General Ormsby Mitchell, who, has, I happen to live in the town that is, one town that happens to be named after him. And we'll be talking a little bit about that and everything related to the Cincinnati Observatory. I know Craig Neigh is on this call, or on this meeting. So we look forward to hearing from him. And then the following week on November 11th, we will be hearing from Marty Shadler about the women of the Kentucky Aviation Hall of Fame in honor of Veterans Day. So I hope everyone comes back again next week. And on behalf of all Behringer-Crawford Museum staff and trustees, thank you all so much. And I hope you have a great night. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.